The first thing she noticed was the silence. A thick, heavy kind of quiet that only exists in the hour before the world remembers itself. It was that deep blue dark, the kind that presses against the windows, the kind that feels less like an absence of light and more like its own living thing. Sarah was awake again. She'd been tracing the same crack in the ceiling for what felt like hours. Her apartment always felt too big at night, the empty space echoing a hollowness inside her that a new city and a new job were supposed to fill, but hadn't. Not even close. The move was supposed to be a fresh start, a brave new chapter. It just felt like a different kind of lonely. She finally gave up, her feet finding the cold wood floor. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She moved to the kitchen window, more out of habit than hope, her fingers pulling back the edge of the blind just a fraction. Her gaze automatically drifted across the street, past the chain-link fence, to the graveyard of forgotten things. The old scrapyard. It was a mess of rust and shadows, a skeleton of a place. And there, in the middle of it all, was the shell of an old sedan, a Honda Civic that had probably last seen the road around the time she was in high school. Its paint was blistered and faded to the color of a bruise. She wasn't sure why she looked for her every night. Maybe it was the ritual of it, the one constant in this shapeless new life. The stray, a sliver of tortoiseshell fur and wary green eyes. She'd first seen her weeks ago, a flash of movement in the tall weeds behind the scrapyard. A ghost. Over time, Sarah had started putting a bowl of food out on her fire escape. Just a little offering to the universe. The cat would never approach, while she was there. Sarah would have to go back inside, turn off the kitchen light, and watch from the darkness. Only then would the creature emerge, a cautious, low-to-the-ground shadow, to eat with a frantic, desperate speed, her head snapping up between every bite to scan for threats. But tonight was different. The food bowl from last evening was still, full, the kibble untouched, beaded with a fine, cold mist. That was the first wrong thing. The second was the faint, almost imperceptible flicker of movement from inside the abandoned Civic. Sarah squinted, her breath fogging a small circle on the cold glass. There. Again. A shift in the deepest shadow of the car's back seat. It was her. She was in there. Not just near it, but inside it. Hiding. A cold knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. It was late November. A mean, wet wind had been whipping all day, the kind that promised a hard frost, or worse. The cat had always been skittish, but she'd never hidden before. She'd always been out in the open, a sentinel in her kingdom of rust. This was new. This was the behavior of an animal that was hurt, or sick, or truly, deeply terrified. Sarah's hand went to her own abdomen, a subconscious gesture. She'd been feeling a little hollowed out herself lately, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. She knew what it was to put on a brave face, to pretend everything was fine when your world was quietly crumbling. She'd been doing it for months, since the phone call, since the diagnosis that wasn't for her, but might as well have been. Since the long, slow goodbye to her mother in a room that smelled of antiseptic and faded perfume. The move across the country was supposed to be an escape from the ghosts. But you can't outrun a ghost when you're the one carrying it. She saw a flicker of those green eyes now, from the jagged hole where the Civic's rear window had been. They weren't just wary tonight. They were wide, shining with a primal fear that Sarah could feel, even from across the street, even through a pane of glass. This wasn't just a stray cat avoiding the cold. This was something else. This was the silent, still panic of a creature that knows it has nowhere left to run. The cat's head dropped low and her body tensed. Sarah followed her line of sight. A dog was being walked down the far end of the street, its owner illuminated for a moment under the jaundiced glow of a street lamp. The cat didn't move a muscle, didn't even seem to breathe. She just became part of the shadow, her entire being focused on absolute stillness, on not being seen. It was a level of hypervigilance that spoke of a long, hard life on the edges of everything. Sarah found herself holding her own breath, her knuckles white where they gripped the windowsill. She was a 32-year-old woman standing in her cold kitchen in the dead of night, silently rooting for a feral cat she'd never touched, never heard meow, never even gotten within 20 feet of. It felt ridiculous, and yet, it felt like the most important thing in the world. In that moment, That cat's survival was everything. Her fierce, lonely independence was a mirror Sarah didn't want to look into, but couldn't turn away from. Fie. Dog and its owner turned a corner, their footsteps fading into the night. The cat remained frozen for a full minute longer, a statue in the ruins. Only then did she slowly, ever so slowly, relax her posture. She didn't settle. She just unclenched. Her gaze, however, drifted from the street back towards Sarah's window. It was as if she knew she was being watched, as if she'd always known. Their eyes met through 2 panes of dirty glass and 100 feet of cold, dark air. There was no affection in that look, no plea for help. It was just a raw, unguarded acknowledgement. I see you seeing me. I know you are there. The moment stretched, thin and fragile. In that shared silence, Sarah felt a connection so profound it ached. It was the connection of 2 solitary creatures, holding their respective vigils in the dark, both of them nursing wounds. The other couldn't see, and then the cat did something she had never ever done before. She didn't look away. She didn't bolt. She slowly, deliberately, lowered her head onto her paws, her eyes still fixed on Sarah. It wasn't a gesture of sleep. It was one of exhaustion, a surrender. It was the posture of something that has carried a weight for so long, its bones are tired. It was in that moment, watching the proud feral creature finally show the crushing weight of its fatigue, that Sarah understood. This wasn't just about a bowl of food anymore. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed in the dark. A soft, almost silent sigh escaped the cat then. A plume of steam in the frigid air of the car's interior. Her sides shuddered with it. And as she exhaled, Sarah saw it. The subtle, unmistakable rounding of her belly, pressed against the torn upholstery of the seat. It wasn't just the fluff of her winter coat. It was a firm, full curve, a truth she'd been hiding. The untouched food, the seeking of shelter, the deep, bone-weary exhaustion. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't just fear. It was life. She was pregnant, and she was alone. And winter was coming. The knowledge hit Sarah like a physical blow, a sucker punch to the chest that stole her air. This fragile, fierce being wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was a fortress, a provider, a future, all on her own. The weight of it was terrifying. The absolute loneliness of it was a reflection so sharp it made Sarah's eyes burn. She didn't think. She didn't plan. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She let the blind fall back into place and turned from the window. She walked to the cupboard, her footsteps loud in the silent apartment. She found the can of premium tuna she'd bought on a whim, the one she'd been saving for a fancy salad she never got around to making. The can opener whirred in the silence, a shocking, mechanical sound. The rich, oily smell filled the kitchen. She forked the whole thing into a clean bowl, not flaking it, just a solid, generous mound of protein and hope. She pulled on her big coat over her pajamas, not bothering with shoes, just shoving her feet into the worn-out clogs by the door. For bowl was warm in her hand. The hallway floor was icy on her bare ankles. She pushed open the heavy front door of her building, and the night air rushed in, so cold it felt like needles in her lungs. She crossed the street, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast, sleeping silence. The chain-link fence was cold and gritty under her fingers. She found the loose spot she'd noticed weeks ago, and pushed through, the metal groaning in protest. Weeds, stiff with frost, crunched under her clogs. The scrapyard felt enormous and alien at night, a landscape of jagged, sharp-edged shadows. She approached the car slowly, each step deliberate, trying to telegraph her movements. The cat was watching her, those green eyes wide again, but she hadn't fled. She was still lying down, but her muscles were coiled, ready for flight. Sarah stopped a good 10 feet from the broken window. She could smell the car now. Old rust, damp upholstery, and the faint wild scent of cat. She didn't speak. Words felt too loud, too human for this moment. She just slowly knelt down on the cold, hard ground, the frost immediately soaking through the thin fabric of her pajama pants. She placed the bowl of tuna on a relatively flat piece of concrete near the car's front tire. Then she did the hardest thing. She leaned back, away from the food, and sat on her heels, making herself as small and non-threatening as possible. She dropped her gaze, looking at the ground near the bowl, not directly at the cat. An offering. No strings attached. She waited. The cold seeped up through her bones. A minute passed. 2. She could hear the cat's breathing. A little quick, a little shallow. She heard a small, almost inaudible shift inside the car. Sarah didn't move. She just stayed there, a statue in the freezing dark, offering the only thing she had. A silent promise. A tiny flickering signal in the vast, cold night. I see you. I see your weight. You are not alone. And then, a movement. A slow, careful unfolding. The cat emerged, from the broken window, not with her usual skittish energy, but with a heavy, deliberate grace. She moved like something ancient, something that knew the cost of every single action. She ignored the bowl for a moment. She took 2 steps towards Sarah, stopping just an arm's length away. She lifted her head, and for the second time that night, their eyes met. No glass between them now, just the cold, honest air. The cat looked from Sarah's face down to the bowl of food, and then back to her face. It was a clear, conscious acknowledgement, a transaction seen and understood. But then she did something else. She took one more half-step forward. She didn't meow. She didn't purr. She just looked at Sarah. And then very slowly, deliberately, she closed her eyes. Not a blink. A long, slow, purposeful close. She held it for 3 full seconds before opening them again. It was the most vulnerable thing Sarah had ever seen. In the language of cats, it was the ultimate gesture of trust. It was saying, I am choosing to be unguarded with you. I am showing you I am not afraid. In that silent, frozen moment, in a junkyard at 4 in the morning, a bridge was built between 2 worlds. It was made of tuna steam and frost, of grief and hope, of one slow blink that contained a universe, of unspoken words. Sarah felt a tear, hot and completely unexpected, trace a path down her cold cheek. She didn't dare move. She just breathed, her own breath a white cloud mingling with the night. The moment stretched, thin and beautiful and fragile as a soap bubble. Then, the cat turned her head, dipped it toward the bowl, and began to eat. Not with her usual frantic urgency, but with a measured, almost relieved pace. She was eating for 2. For 5. For a future she was fighting for with every fiber of her being. Sarah stayed kneeling in the frost, watching, her own loneliness momentarily forgotten, replaced by a fierce protective urge so strong it shook her. The story wasn't over, it had only just begun. And the quiet knowledge of that, of the struggle and hope huddled in that rusted car, settled over her shoulders. It was a weight, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a weight that pulled her down. It was one that held her in place. It was an anchor. Something had begun. Something real. You're here, listening. And that means more than you. No. If you feel safe in these stories, your 1 subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The cold of the concrete had seeped so deep into her knees that the feeling didn't fully return until she was back inside her apartment, the heater groaning to life, her pajama pants soaked through, and clinging to her skin. She stood by the sink, running warm water over her numb hands, but her mind was still across the street, in the dark. That slow blink replayed behind her eyes, on a loop. It felt like a secret she'd been told. A fragile, precious thing she had to hold with the utmost care. She'd left the empty tuna bowl there. A part of her worried that taking it back would feel like taking back the moment, like revoking the unspoken treaty they'd just signed in the frost. Sleep was impossible after that. The gray light of dawn was already bleeding into the sky. She made coffee, the rich smell a stark contrast to the memory of rust and cold air. Her body was exhausted, a hollowed-out shell, but her mind was buzzing, hyper-aware. Every few minutes she'd drift back to the window, trying to be casual, trying not to look like she was staring. The cat was gone from the car. The bowl was licked clean, sitting exactly where she'd left it. A small, fierce pride bloomed in Sarah's chest. She'd eaten it all. For a creature that lived on the knife's edge of survival, that was a monumental act of trust. She hadn't been too frightened to eat. That day at work was a blur of pixelated screens and muffled voices. Sarah was a graphic designer, a job that suited her quiet nature. But today, the silence of her cubicle felt different. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghost of green eyes and the profound silence of a junkyard at 4 a.m. She found herself sketching on a stray piece of paper. Not logos or layouts, but the curve of a feline back, the sharp angle of an ear, the pattern of tortoiseshell fur. Her coworker, Mark, stopped by to ask about a project file and glanced at the drawing. "Cute cat." "Yours?" he asked, his tone light, conversational. The question caught her off guard. "No," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "No, she's a neighbor." The word felt strangely right. They were neighbors, in the broadest, most beautiful sense of the word. Sharing a space, acknowledging each other's existence. That evening, the ritual changed. It was no longer just about putting out food and retreating. It was an appointment. She found herself hurrying home, a new, purposeful energy in her step. She stopped at the store and bought real cat food, both wet and dry, the kind with fancy labels promising optimal nutrition for demanding felines. She felt a little silly, buying premium food for a feral cat. But the thought of that rounded belly, of the hidden lives growing inside it, made anything less feel like an insult. The sun was already dipping below the skyline, painting the clouds in shades of violet and orange when she prepared the new offering. A small scoop of kibble and half a can of the wet food, something Pat-style with succulent chicken. She put it on a proper ceramic plate from her cupboard, the blue one with the chipped rim she never used. It felt more dignified than a plastic bowl. She crossed the street with the same deliberate care as the night before, her heart doing that same nervous flutter. The scrapyard was less intimidating in the dusk, but still held its air of forgotten melancholy. She placed the blue plate right next the empty tuna bowl from the previous night, a few feet from the car's front tire. She didn't kneel this time. She just stood there for a moment, her hands shoved in her pockets, and whispered into the cooling air. "It's me. Just me." She retreated to her now usual spot, about 15 feet away, and leaned against the rusted shell of an old pickup truck, its bed filled with rotten leaves. She waited. The minutes stretched. The streetlights flickered on with a low hum, one by one, casting long, distorted shadows through the graveyard of metal. She was about to give up, to assume the cat was elsewhere for the night, when a movement caught her eye. She emerged from the passenger side door, which was hanging open on one broken hinge. She didn't come straight to the food. She moved along the periphery, a fluid shadow against darker shadows, her body low. She stopped. She sniffed the air, her head tilted. She was cataloging every change. The new food, the new plate. Sarah's presence, already waiting. It was a risk. Would the change be too much? The cat took a cautious step toward the plate, then another. She stretched her neck, her nose twitching violently, and gave the wet food the most delicate, investigative sniff. She recoiled for a second, as if surprised by the intensity of the smell. Then, curiosity overcoming caution, she dipped her head and took a tiny, tentative lick. She froze, processing. And then, it was like a switch flipped. She began to eat, not with the frantic hunger of before, but with a focused, appreciative gusto. A low, rumbling sound started, so quiet it was almost vibration more than noise. A purr. It was the first time Sarah had ever heard her make a sound that wasn't a hiss of fear or the crunch of kibble. It was a sound of contentment. A sound of peace. Sarah leaned her head back against the cold metal of the truck, a smile spreading across her face that was so involuntary, it almost hurt her cheeks. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. She watched the cat eat every last morsel, then meticulously clean the blue plate with her rough tongue. When she was done, she didn't immediately vanish. She sat back on her haunches, right there in the open, and began the meticulous process of washing her face, one paw dragging over an ear in a practiced, efficient motion. This was different. This was a creature feeling safe enough to perform its ablutions in the open, in the presence of another. It was a monumental shift. Sarah didn't move a muscle, afraid to break the spell. The cat finished her bath, gave one satisfied lick to her lips, and then she looked at Sarah. Not a wary, assessing look, a simple acknowledgement. Then she turned, hopped back up into the Civic through the broken door, and disappeared into the dark interior. She was home. This became their new routine. Every evening, as the light failed, Sarah would cross the street with the blue plate. Some nights the cat was already there, waiting, sitting patiently by the old tire. Other nights, Sarah would have to wait, her breath making clouds in the air, until the shadow would detach itself from the greater darkness of the scrapyard. The offerings became more elaborate. Sarah started bringing a thermos of hot tea for herself, and she'd sit on an upturned plastic crate she'd dragged over, sipping the steaming liquid while her neighbor ate her dinner. It was the quietest, most peaceful part of her day, the part she began to live for. She started to learn the cat's language. The subtle flick of a tail tip meant she was annoyed by a noise down the street. The way her ears would swivel like satellite dishes, independent of each other, tracking the flight of a moth or the scuttle of a beetle in the weeds. The slow blink became their greeting. Sarah would arrive, place the food down, and then sit on her crate. She'd catch the cat's eye and slowly, deliberately, close her own eyes and open them. More often than not, she'd get one in return. A hello. I see you. I am not afraid. The cat's belly was growing. There was no doubt now. It was a pronounced, heavy swell that swayed slightly when she walked. She moved with more care, her jumps up into the car becoming more calculated, a little less graceful. She was eating more too. Sarah started bringing a full can of food, plus kibble. The responsibility of it was a quiet hum in the back of her mind. This wasn't just a stray anymore. This was a mother-to-be, a family. One night, about a week into their new routine, it started to rain. Not a downpour, but a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked everything and made the world feel muffled and gray. Sarah hurried across the street, her hood pulled up, the blue plate protected under her jacket. She set the food down in its usual spot, the rain already starting to bead on the ceramic. She retreated to her crate, which was now under the partial shelter of the pickup truck's remains. The cat emerged from the car, but hesitated at the edge of the open door, her nose wrinkling at the wetness. She didn't want to get her fur wet. Sarah understood immediately. Without really thinking, she stood up, walked over, and picked up the blue plate. She moved slowly, her movements telegraphed. She walked right up to the gaping door of the Civic, and holding her breath, placed the plate just inside the car, on the gritty, metal floorboard. It was the closest she had ever been. She could smell the cat's unique scent, dry leaves, warm fur, and that faint, wild smell. She could see the individual white hairs mixed into the tortoise shell on her chest. The cat watched her, her eyes wide but not panicked. She didn't hiss. She didn't back away. She just watched, her body tense, but holding its ground. Sarah retreated back to her crate, her heart hammering. The cat looked from the retreating human to the food now conveniently located in her dry living room. After a moment's consideration, she ducked her head inside and began to eat, sheltered from the rain. Sarah sat on her wet crate, the drizzle cooling her heated face, and she felt a tear mix with the rainwater. It was such a small thing, moving a plate 12 inches, but it felt like moving a mountain. It was collaboration. It was understanding. She was being allowed to help in a tiny, practical way. The trust was no longer just emotional. It was functional. It had weight and purpose. The days bled into each other, a soft rhythm of work and twilight vigils. Sarah's own life, which had felt so achingly empty, began to feel structured, purposeful. The crushing weight of her grief for her mother was still there, a permanent stone in her gut. But it was no longer the only thing she carried. She was carrying this too, this fragile, growing hope. She found herself talking sometimes, as she sat there in the gathering dark. Not to the cat directly, but just speaking thoughts into the air. feeling them be heard by a non-judgmental presence. "Tough day at the office today," she'd murmur, watching the cat lick the plate clean. "Client hated every draft. Felt like I couldn't do anything right." The cat would pause in her washing, her ears twitching toward the sound of Sarah's voice, then resume, as if digesting the information along with her dinner. Another night, the words came out before she could stop them, raw and unbidden. "I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe sometimes." Her voice cracked on the last word. The cat, who had been sitting contentedly after her meal, stopped everything. She turned her head and looked directly at Sarah, her green eyes unblinking in the dim light. She didn't look away. She just held the gaze, and in that look, Sarah felt no pity, no confusion. She felt a simple, profound acknowledgement. A shared understanding of loss, perhaps, of the weight of existing. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? This was more than waiting. This was witnessing. The weather turned colder. The drizzle became sleet, then a proper frost that coated the world in a thin, glittering skin every morning. Sarah started bringing other things. An old, worn-out sweater she didn't care about. And one night, when she was sure the cat was off hunting elsewhere, she approached the Civic with a flashlight and a hammering heart. The interior was a disaster of springs and stained foam poking through ripped vinyl. It was damp. It was cold. The wind whistled through the broken windows. Her eyes stung. She couldn't do much. But she could do something. She folded the sweater into a tight square and shoved it as far back under the dashboard as she could reach, creating a small, hidden nest that was at least off the bare metal and out of the direct draft. It was a pathetic offering to a queen, but it was all she had. The next evening, she brought a small, deep Tupperware container and placed it near the car, filling it with fresh water. She'd read that dehydration was a real risk for pregnant cats. The cat investigated the new object with her usual caution, then took a long, grateful drink. Sarah's heart swelled. She was solving problems. She was making it marginally better. And then, one night, the breakthrough came. It was the coldest night yet. The air was sharp and still, the kind of cold that hurts your teeth. Sarah had brought the food, a double portion of extra appealing salmon pâté, and placed it inside the car door as usual. She'd also brought a thick wool blanket for herself, wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl as she sat on her crate. The cat ate, but she was slower than usual, her movements heavier, more cumbersome. Her time was getting close, Sarah realized. The thought sent a jolt of anxiety through her. When the cat was finished, she didn't immediately retreat into the depths of the car. She sat in the doorway, her large belly resting on the doorframe, and she looked at Sarah. Really looked. And then she did something she had never done before. She took a step out of the car, and then another. She wasn't coming toward the food. The food was gone. She was coming toward Sarah. Sarah stopped breathing. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. The cat moved slowly, with that heavy, pregnant waddle, until she was about 3 feet away. She stopped. Sarah could see the detail of her whiskers, the little patches of fur missing from one ear from some old fight, the gentle rise and fall of her swollen sides as she breathed. The air between them crackled with potential. The cat looked at Sarah's hand, which was resting on her knee, clutching the edge of the wool blanket. She took one more step, then another. She closed the final distance. She didn't rub against her. She didn't headbutt her. She simply leaned forward, ever so slightly, and placed the very tip of her cold, damp nose against the back of Sarah's motionless hand. It was the briefest of contacts. A fraction of a second. A touch so light it was like being kissed by a snowflake. It was cool and damp, and sent an electric jolt of pure feeling straight up Sarah's arm and into her heart. Then, as if the effort had used all her courage, the cat turned and walked with as much dignity as she could muster, back to her car. She paused at the door, gave Sarah one last, unreadable look, and then vanished into the darkness inside. Sarah sat there, in the freezing cold, for a long, long time. She looked down at the spot on her hand where the nose had touched her. The skin still tingled. It was the first time they had ever touched. It wasn't a demand for affection. It wasn't a request for food. It was a statement. A punctuation mark at the end of a long, silent sentence they had been writing together for weeks. I am here. You are here. We are in this together. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, but the cold couldn't touch her. A warmth was blooming from within, a fierce, protective, overwhelming love for this wild, brave, lonely creature. The bond was no longer building. It was built. It was solid. It was real. And as she finally stood to go back to her own warm apartment, she knew, with a certainty that shook her, that everything was about to change. The trust had been given. Now, it would be tested. The ghost of that touch lingered on her skin for days, a cold, pinpoint sensation that seemed to have seeped into her veins, a permanent reminder of the line that had been crossed. Sarah would find herself staring at the back of her hand during work meetings, during her commute, in the quiet moments before sleep, half expecting to see a physical mark there. But there was nothing. Just the memory, which was somehow more potent. It had been a key turning in a lock, and now a door was open that could never be fully closed again. Their evenings settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The cat, whom Sarah had started to call Mama in the quiet of her own mind, though she'd never dared speak the name aloud, now waited for her. Every night, as Sarah approached with the blue plate, she would be sitting there, not in the shadows, but right out in the open by the passenger door of the Civic, her tail curled neatly around her feet. Her swollen belly was a planet, pulling everything into its gravitational field. She was slower, more deliberate in her movements, and her appetite was a ferocious, magnificent thing. Sarah had upgraded to 2 full cans of the most calorie-dense food she could find, plus a hefty scoop of kibble for crunch. It was a small fortune in premium cat food, and she didn't care a bit. The eating ritual had changed too. Mama no longer devoured the food with the frantic urgency of a starving animal. She ate with the focused, purposeful intent of someone building something, fueling a furnace. After she was done, she would often not retreat immediately. She would sit, sometimes even lie down on her side right there in the doorway, her immense bulk making the position look both uncomfortable and utterly necessary. She would wash her face with a tired, thorough diligence, and then she would just watch Sarah. Her green eyes were less wary now, more contemplative. It was during these quiet, post-dinner moments that Sarah would talk. She told her about her mother. Not the sick, fading version in the hospital bed, but the vibrant woman she had been. The one who grew ridiculous, over-engineered tomato plants on their apartment balcony, the one who could never remember the words to songs and would just hum loudly off-key. The one who'd taught Sarah how to mix the exact right shade of cerulean blue with her watercolors. The stories came out haltingly at first, then in a quiet, steady stream, words disappearing into the cold, dark air, witnessed only by a tortoiseshell cat and a universe of silent, rusted metal. It was a confessional without a priest, a eulogy without a funeral. And it felt lighter, somehow, to have spoken the memories into existence outside of her own head. But then, the patterns began to shift. The first change was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that Sarah almost dismissed it. It was a Thursday. The air had a bitter metallic taste, a promise of snow. Mama had eaten her dinner with her usual single-mindedness, cleaned the plate, and then, instead of settling down for her post-meal rest, she had gotten up with a soft grunt of effort. She'd looked at Sarah, given one of her slow, deliberate blinks, and then turned and vanished into the dark interior of the car. This wasn't unusual. She often went deeper inside to her nest under the dashboard, but a moment later she reappeared, and in her mouth she was carrying something. It was small and dark. She walked the few steps to her usual spot in the doorway, dropped the object onto the ground with a faint clink, looked directly at Sarah, and then turned and disappeared again for the night. Sarah waited until she was sure Mama wasn't coming. Back out. Curiosity buzzing under her skin, she walked over, pulling her phone from her pocket to use the flashlight. Lying on the frozen dirt was a single rusted bottle cap, the kind from a glass soda bottle. It was old, the edges soft with corrosion. The once red paint faded to a dusty pink. She picked it up. It was ice cold. It meant nothing. It was junk, scrapyard detritus. And yet, the act felt intentional. It wasn't dropped by accident. It was presented, placed. A gift? She felt silly, standing in a junkyard, puzzling over a piece of trash left by a cat. She pocketed the bottle cap, a faint, confused smile on her face. "Okay, Mama," she whispered to the dark car. "Thank you." She thought it was a one-off, a weird, random occurrence. But it happened again 2 nights later. This time the offering was a small, smooth riverstone, gray and worn flat by time and weather. Again, the ritual was the same. The meal, the cleanup, the retreat into the car, the return with the object held gently in her mouth, the deliberate placement, the direct eye contact, and then the final retirement for the evening. A knot of something, wonder, confusion, a low-grade anxiety, began to form in Sarah's stomach. This was new language, a new dialect in their silent communication. What was she saying? Was it payment? Was it a token? Was it just the instinct of a creature whose world was built of found things? The gifts kept coming. They were never food-related, never remains of a kill. They were inert objects, curiosities. A frayed length of blue nylon string, knotted and hardened by the elements. A single stark white dove feather, perfectly intact. A shard of sea-green pottery, its edges worn smooth and safe. Each one was placed with the same solemn ceremony. Each one was met with Sarah's quiet, "Thank you," and each one she pocketed and took home. She started a small pile of them, on her windowsill, the bottle cap, the stone, the string, the feather, the pottery shard, a museum of mystery, a collection of questions. She found herself researching online, her search history filling with terms like, "Why do cats bring gifts to humans?" and "cat-presenting objects behavior." The answers were a mix of the practical and the poignant. Instinctual hunting behavior, presenting prey to a family member who can't hunt. A sign of trust and affection. Teaching. Or, the one that made her throat tighten, a reciprocation. You provide food, I provide this, a thank you. An attempt to contribute to the household. But this wasn't a household. This was a junkyard. And Mama was getting bigger, slower, more burdened by the day. The gifts felt less like a cute quirk, and more like a vital, urgent communication. A thread of something deeper was being woven, and Sarah couldn't see the pattern. The second, more worrying shift was in Mama's absences. She had always been a creature of impeccable, predictable timing. Always there, waiting, as the sun dipped below the horizon. But now, some evenings, Sarah would arrive with the steaming blue plate to an empty spot by the car. The first time it happened, a cold dread, sharp and immediate, lanced through her. She'd called out, a soft, hesitant, "Hello, Mama?" Her voice was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. She'd placed the food inside the car and retreated, to her crate, her tea forgotten, going cold between her hands. The minutes stretched into half an hour. 45 minutes. The light faded completely, and the temperature plummeted. Just as she was about to give up, convinced something terrible had happened, a shadow had detached itself from the far corner of the scrapyard. Mama moved slowly, laboriously, across the open ground. She didn't run. She didn't slink. She just walked, her head low, her gait a tired waddle. She went straight to the food and began to eat, but without her usual gusto. She looked worn, exhausted in a way that went beyond the physical strain of pregnancy. Sarah stayed perfectly still, watching. When Mama was done, she didn't bring a gift. She didn't even clean the plate. She just turned and hauled herself back into the car, vanishing without a backward glance. She hadn't even acknowledged Sarah's presence. It was a rejection. That felt like a physical blow. This started happening more frequently. Every few days, Mama would be missing at dinner time, and when she did return, she was always more tired, more distant. Her fur sometimes looking faintly dusty or disheveled, as if she'd been squeezing through tight, dirty spaces. Where was she going? Why was she expending that precious, limited energy? She was days, maybe hours, away from giving birth. She should be conserving every ounce of strength, hunkered down in her nest, not roaming. The worry became a constant gnawing companion for Sarah. It sat with her at her desk, its cold weight in her lap during her commute, its whisper in her ear as she tried to sleep. The joyful connection she'd felt was now frayed, with fear. She started going over earlier, sometimes on her lunch break, just to check. She'd peer into the dark interior of the Civic, but Mama's nest was tucked too far under the dashboard to see. All she could see was the empty blue plate from the night before. One afternoon, driven by a spike of anxiety, she did something she knew was a violation. She waited until the street was empty, pushed through the fence, and approached the car. She knelt down in the cold mud by the open passenger door and shone her phone's light into the darkness under the dash. The old sweater was there, a rumpled lump. But it was different. It had been worked, nosed and pawed into a more deliberate, cup-like shape, a nest, a proper one, and surrounding it, arranged in a loose, almost ceremonial circle, were other objects. A dusty bolt, a crumpled leaf, a piece of colored glass. She was building a nursery. She was gathering things for her kittens. The sight was so intimate, so vulnerably animal, that Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She quickly pulled back, feeling like she'd spied on something sacred. But the discovery only deepened the mystery. If she was building her nest here, why was she leaving? Where was she going? The anxiety built to a peak a few days later. A winter storm was forecast, a real one, promising several inches of snow and plunging temperatures. The kind of cold that was deadly for newborns. Sarah's plan, half-formed and desperate, had been to somehow lure Mama into a carrier and bring her inside for the duration. It was a foolish plan. Mama was still a feral cat. There would be no luring. It would be a traumatic, likely failed capture. That evening, the sky was a leaden, oppressive gray, and the wind had a new, brutal edge to it. Sarah crossed the street, her heart a frantic bird in a cage of ribs. The blue plate in her hands felt like a meaningless token against the coming fury of nature. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that this was it. The babies were coming tonight, or during the storm tomorrow. They would be born in a frozen metal tomb. She reached the car. No, Mama. The spot by the door was empty. The knot in Sarah's stomach pulled taut. No, she whispered to the wind. Not tonight. Please be here. She placed the food inside the door and went to her crate, pulling her coat tight around her. The wind moaned through the carcasses of old cars, a lonely, terrible sound. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. The light was fading fast, the world turning monochrome. The first few flakes of snow, tiny and hard as grit, began to swirl in the air. Panic started to set in, cold and sharp. She was out there, in this. In her condition. Sarah stood up, her body trembling with cold and fear. She had to find her. She had to do something. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was a rescue mission. And then she saw it. A movement, not from the edges of the scrapyard, but from the direction of her own apartment building. Mama was emerging from behind a dumpster in the alley next to Sarah's building. She was moving even slower than usual, her body low to the ground. She wasn't just tired. She was spent. Finished. She didn't go to the food first. She walked, with a terrifying, single-minded determination, straight towards Sarah. Her gait was different, stiff. Her eyes were fixed on Sarah with an intensity that was completely new. It wasn't a look of trust, or hunger, or even exhaustion. It was a look of pure, unadulterated purpose. She stopped at Sarah's feet, looked up, and let out a sound Sarah had never heard from her before. It wasn't a meow. It was a low, guttural, almost hoarse chirp. A sound of profound urgency. She took a step, then turned her head back to look at Sarah, as if to say, "Follow me." Then she did something that shocked Sarah to her core. She turned, and began to walk, not back towards her safe place, her nest in the Civic, but towards the back of Sarah's apartment building. Towards the rusty, creaking door that led to the basement. A door that, Sarah realized with a jolt, was slightly ajar, just enough for a determined cat to squeeze through. The pieces, the terrible, wonderful pieces, all fell together in a single, breathtaking moment. The absences, the exhaustion, the disheveled fur. She hadn't been roaming aimlessly. She hadn't been searching for a new place. She had been working. She had been preparing. She had found another place. A better place. A secret place. And she had waited until the last possible second. Until the storm was literally at the gate, to show her. To ask for help. Mama stopped, at the cracked basement door, looked back at Sarah one more time, her green eyes blazing in the twilight with a message that was now, finally, perfectly clear. Her routine hadn't just changed. It had been leading to this all along. The cliffhanger wasn't soft anymore. It was a siren. The cat vanished into the dark crack of the doorway, leaving Sarah standing alone in the swirling snow, her heart hammering against her chest, the untouched plate of food forgotten. The entire world narrowed down to that single open door. The world stopped. The moan of the wind, the bite of the cold, the lazy, ominous swirl of the first snowflakes, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. The only thing that existed was that dark, narrow crack in the basement door, and the space where the cat had just been. Sarah stood frozen, her mind trying to catch up with what her eyes had just seen, what her heart already knew. Mama hadn't just wandered off. She had led her here. She had issued a summons, and she had just walked into the one place Sarah had never ever considered. The basement. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather seized her. It was the cold of a forgotten memory, the cold of a door best left closed. The basement of her building was a tomb. It was where the ghosts of old tenants lived, in the form of broken exercise equipment and boxes of mildewed books. It was a labyrinth of concrete pillars and hanging, bare bulbs that cast more shadow than light. It was damp. It was dark. It was the last place on Earth a creature would choose to have its babies. Unless it wasn't a choice. Unless it was a desperate, final gambit. Follow me. The unspoken command hung in the icy air. Sarah's feet felt bolted to the frozen ground. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to go back to her warm apartment, to her predictable life of grief and quiet design work. This was too much. This was crossing a threshold from which there was no return. This was stepping into the wild, raw, messy heart of something she wasn't sure she was strong enough to handle. But then she saw it again. The look in Mama's eyes. Not a plea. A statement. A transfer of responsibility. It was a look that said, "The time for watching from the window is over." A sound escaped Sarah's lips. A half gasp, half sob, swallowed by the wind. She took a step forward. Then another. Her legs were numb, moving on a will that was not entirely her own. She pushed the heavy, rust-scabbed metal door. It groaned on its hinges, a sound of protest that echoed deep into the darkness within. The smell that wafted out was ancient. Damp concrete, dust, the faint, sweet rot of decaying paper, and underneath it all, the unmistakable coppery tang of birth. Her breath hitched. It was happening. It was happening right now, in the belly of this forgotten place. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy and stiff with cold. The flashlight beam cut a shaky, narrow path into the gloom, illuminating a steep flight of concrete stairs descending into the black. The steps were littered with dead leaves and grime. She started down them, each footstep echoing too loudly, in the cavernous space. The door swung shut behind her with a final, echoing clang, plunging her into a silence so profound it felt like pressure on her eardrums. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile thing in the immense dark. "It's me. I'm here." She swept the light beam across the basement floor. It was a vast, open space, crowded with the spectral shapes of covered furniture and stacked boxes that threw long, distorted shadows. Pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping occasionally with a slow, rhythmic plink, plink, plink that was the only measure of time. The air was frigid, much colder than outside, a deep, seeped-in cold that held the chill of decades. There was no sign of her. Panic, thin and sharp, began to prick at the edges of Sarah's resolve. What if she'd lost her? What if she'd been wrong? What if the cat was just spooked and hiding, and Sarah was now trespassing in her landlord's basement in the middle of a snowstorm based on a delusion? Then, from the deepest, darkest corner of the basement, came a sound. It was so soft, it was almost swallowed by the drip of the water. A low, rumbling purr. But it was different from the contented purr over food. This was deeper, more vibrational. A motor trying to turn over on a cold day. A sound of intense, focused effort. And then, a tiny, high-pitched mewling. So faint it was like the sound of a single raindrop. Then another, and another. Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She moved toward the sound, her flashlight beam bouncing over the floor. The corner was dominated by an old, disintegrating coal furnace, a hulking iron beast that hadn't been used in 50 years. Behind it, tucked into a small alcove formed by the furnace and the foundation wall, was a mountain of old, discarded moving blankets, mildewed and gray with dust. And there, in the very center of a nest she had painstakingly carved out of the filthy blankets, was Mama. She was lying on her side, her body curved in a protective C. Her breathing was ragged, her sides heaving with the effort. Her eyes were slits of pure concentration, glazed with a primal focus Sarah had never seen in any living thing. She was utterly present, and yet utterly somewhere else, riding a wave of instinct as old as time. And swarming around her, blindly nosing and mewling, were 4 tiny, wet, impossibly small creatures. Their eyes were sealed shut, their bodies hairless and pink, like little plums. They were squirming, searching, their miniature mouths opening, and closing in a silent, desperate quest for the one thing that would sustain them. A 5th kitten, slick and new, was just emerging into the world as Sarah watched, frozen in place, her hand clamped over her mouth to stifle a cry. She was witnessing a miracle, a raw, messy, terrifying miracle happening on a pile of rags in a freezing basement. The sheer vulnerability of it was staggering. The fierce, brutal effort of the mother. The blind, total dependence of the newborns. It was the most beautiful and the most horrifying thing she had ever seen. Mama's head lifted slightly, her green eyes finding Sarah's in the beam of the flashlight. There was no surprise, no fear, just a flicker of acknowledgement before another contraction seized her, and her body tensed, a low groan escaping her. She was still in the thick of it. The job wasn't done. The spell broke. Sarah wasn't a spectator anymore. She was a participant. The cold in the basement was a tangible threat. Those tiny, hairless bodies would lose heat in minutes. The filthy blankets were no place for this. Her own grief, her own loneliness, shrank to the size of a pebble and vanished. There was no room for it here. There was only this emergency, this life. She acted without thinking. She shrugged off her heavy winter coat, the one that smelled of her perfume and her apartment, and knelt on the cold concrete, ignoring the shock of it through her jeans. She didn't reach for the cat. She didn't try to touch the kittens. She just laid her coat down, a few feet from the nest, a clean, warm offering, a better place. "It's okay, Mama," she murmured, her voice finding a steadiness she didn't know she possessed. "It's okay. You're doing so good. You're so brave. Just when you're ready. There's a warmer spot right here." She kept the flashlight beam pointed at the floor, not directly on the struggling family, providing just enough light to see by without being intrusive. She sat back on her heels, her own body starting to shiver violently in the cold, and she waited. She became a statue, a sentinel. Her entire being was focused on the mother cat, sending waves of silent strength, of encouragement, across the few feet that separated them. Do you think animals know when we're at our lowest? Maybe they do. Or maybe they just recognize the same hollowed-out places in us that they carry in themselves. In that moment, Sarah wasn't the lonely, grieving woman from apartment 3B. She was a rock, a steady, calm presence in the storm, and Mama knew it. The final kitten was born. Mama cleaned her babies with a tired, thorough tenderness, her rough tongue stimulating their tiny bodies. One by one, they found their way to her, latching on with an instinctual certainty that made Sarah's eyes well with tears. The quiet, rhythmic sound of nursing replaced the mewling. The immediate crisis had passed, but the greater one remained. The cold was leaching the life out of the air. Sarah could see Mama shivering now, even as she lay curled around her newborns, trying to give them her warmth. The nest of filthy blankets was a death trap of damp and bacteria. Slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, Mama began to move. It was a Herculean effort. She was exhausted, her body spent. She nudged the closest kitten, the one who had just finished nursing, with her nose. Then, with a tenderness that shattered Sarah's heart, she picked it up gently in her mouth, its tiny body dangling, utterly trusting. She lifted her head, her eyes locking with Sarah's. And then, with a painstaking, deliberate movement, she dragged herself the few inches across the concrete and placed the kitten, soft and warm and sleeping, onto the plush, fleece-lined interior of Sarah's coat. Sarah stopped breathing. She didn't move a muscle. She just watched, tears now streaming freely and silently down her cold cheeks. One by one, Mama moved her babies. Each movement was a monumental task. She would rest between them, her breath coming in ragged pants, gathering her strength. Then, she would gently pick up another kitten and deposit it onto the coat. She was moving her entire world. She was trusting Sarah's offering with the most precious things in her universe. When the last kitten was safely nestled into the warm fabric, Mama herself hesitated. She looked at the clean coat. She looked at her filthy, blood-stained nest. She looked at Sarah. The trust had been given in pieces before, a blink, a nose touch, a gift of a bottle cap. This was the whole thing. This was the final surrender. With a soft grunt of effort, she pulled her own tired body onto the coat, settling herself carefully around her babies, encircling them, completing the circle. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire difficult life. It was a sound of utter exhaustion and utter, profound relief. She was still for a long moment, just breathing, her eyes closed. The kittens, sensing her presence, snuggled closer. The purr started again, low and deep and steady this time. A healing sound. A sound of peace. Then she opened her eyes. She looked directly at Sarah, who was still kneeling, shivering. A silent witness to this incredible transfer of trust. Mama held her gaze for a long, steady moment. And then, she did it. She very slowly, very deliberately, lifted her head. She stretched her neck out, across the bodies of her sleeping newborns, and she pressed the top of her head, firmly and purposefully, into the palm of Sarah's trembling, outstretched hand. It wasn't a nuzzle for affection. It wasn't a request. It was a seal. A final, unmistakable gesture of trust. It was the closing of a circuit. It was her saying, in the only way she knew how, I see you. I trust you. We are yours and you are ours. The watching is over. The touch was warm. It was solid. It was everything. Sarah felt the dam break inside her. A sob racked her body, silent and violent. She didn't dare move her hand, letting the cat's head rest there, this ultimate, weighty blessing. She cried for the beauty of it, for the terror of it, for the sheer, overwhelming responsibility now resting in the palm of her hand. She cried for her mother, who would have loved this story more than anything. She cried for all the lonely nights that had led her to this freezing basement, to this moment of being chosen. She finally understood. The gifts, the bottle caps, the feathers, they weren't payments. They were rehearsals. They were her practicing how to give something, anything, to the human who gave her everything. They were the only language she had until this moment, until she could give the thing that truly mattered. Herself. Her family. The moment of understanding wasn't a quiet revelation. It was a tsunami. It washed over her, cleansing and terrifying. All at once. This cat, this fierce, wild, independent soul, hadn't just been surviving the long, cold weeks. She had been assessing. She had been waiting. She had been looking for not just a source of food, but a source of safety. A guardian. And in Sarah's quiet, consistent, non-demanding presence, she had found it. She hadn't been hiding in that abandoned car. She had been waiting, and she had been waiting for her. The storm outside was raging now, wind howling against the foundation walls, snow piling up against the high, grimy windows. But in the small circle of light, on a bed of a winter coat, a new family was warm and safe. And a woman, kneeling on cold concrete, her heart cracked wide open and spilling over, finally saw what had been in front of her all along. This wasn't a rescue. It was an adoption, and she was the one who had been adopted. The world outside the basement ceased to exist. The howling wind, the relentless drumbeat of snow against the high windows, the deep, settling cold, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. The entire universe had shrunk down to the small, sacred circle of light from Sarah's phone, illuminating the makeshift nest on her coat. The only sounds that mattered were the tiny, snuffling breaths of the kittens and the deep, rumbling purr of their mother, a sound so profound and steady it felt like the very heartbeat of the earth itself. Sarah didn't know how long she knelt there, her hand still tingling from the weight of Mama's head, her body shaking with a cocktail of adrenaline, cold and overwhelming emotion. Moving was unthinkable. Leaving was impossible. She was tethered to this spot, a guardian statue in the freezing dark. Her muscles screamed in protest, and the cold was a live wire against her skin now that she'd given up her coat. But she wouldn't have moved for anything. She watched, mesmerized, as the kittens, blind and deaf, navigated their new world purely by instinct and scent. They were a tangle of tiny limbs and soft, damp fur, their bodies no bigger than the palm of her hand. One, a little tortoiseshell like her mother, was noticeably smaller, more frantic in her movements. She kept losing her place, mewling a thin, desperate sound until Mama would gently nudge her back toward the warmth and sustenance she needed. Sarah's designer eye, usually focused on Pantone codes and clean lines, now cataloged every exquisite, imperfect detail. The way one black and white kitten had a single white toe on an otherwise black paw. The way the largest, a sturdy ginger, already seemed to possess a quiet confidence, his belly always full first. They were perfect. They were alive, and they were here, in this most terrible of places, solely because their mother had possessed a courage and a wisdom that left Sarah in awe. The initial seismic shock began to settle into a low, humming awe. The responsibility that had felt so terrifying moments ago began to morph into something else, a purpose, a clear, unequivocal purpose. Her job was no longer to observe from a distance. It was to ensure this tiny, vulnerable pulse of life did not flicker and die in the cold. The thought was no longer frightening. It was a mantra. Keep them safe. Keep them warm. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, she shifted her weight. Her knees cracked in protest. Mama's eyes snapped open, but her gaze was calm, watchful. Sarah reached into her back pocket and pulled out her phone. The battery was at 15%, a lifeline. She had to be smart. She opened the Notes app, her fingers numb and clumsy, and began to type a list. It was a habit from her work life, a way to wrestle chaos into order. Heat source, now 2, clean blankets, towels, food and water for Mama. A box, a contained space. The list was an anchor in the storm of her emotions. It was action. It was a plan. But how? She couldn't leave them, not even for a second. The thought of walking up those stairs through that door and back to her apartment felt like a betrayal of galactic proportions. What if the door stuck? What if she couldn't get back in? What if something happened while she was gone? As if reading her mind, Mama stretched her head forward and gave a soft, questioning murp. It wasn't a sound of alarm. It was a check-in, a conversation. "I'm right here," Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm not going anywhere. We need to make a plan." She looked around the basement, the beam of her flashlight scanning the junk piles with new eyes. No longer just forgotten trash, but a potential resource depot. Her gaze landed on a stack of flattened cardboard boxes near the furnace, waiting for recycling. And beside them, a forgotten relic. A small, ceramic-glazed electric space heater. The old-fashioned kind with glowing red coils. It was coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and the cord was frayed near the plug. Her heart sank. Useless. But then she looked harder. It wasn't plugged into the wall. It was just stored. A wild, desperate hope flickered. She kept the light trained on it. There, a few feet away, partially hidden behind a rolled-up carpet, was a heavy-duty, modern-looking power strip, its little green light glowing like a beacon. It was plugged into an outlet on the ceiling pillar. Someone, at some point, had been working down here. It was a risk. The heater was ancient. It could be a fire hazard. But the cold was a more immediate, more certain danger. It was a calculated gamble she had to take. "Okay," she breathed, more to herself than to the cat. "Okay. I'm going to move just a little bit. I'm getting that." She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a bomb disposal expert. Every shift of her weight, every crunch of grit under her shoe, sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Mama watched her, her eyes tracking Sarah's progress, but she didn't tense up. She didn't stop purring. She just watched, a queen observing her most trusted knight. Sarah reached the heater. It was lighter than it looked. She dragged it carefully across the floor, the dust making her nose itch. She plugged it into the power strip, said a silent prayer to any god that might be listening, and turned the knob. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a faint click and a smell of burning dust, the coils began to glow a faint, reassuring orange. A wave of warmth, subtle but undeniable, began to radiate out. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She positioned it carefully, not too close, pointing its meager warmth toward the nest. It wasn't enough to heat the vast basement, but it would take the killing edge off the air immediately around them. Mama seemed to understand. She let out another long, sighing breath, and settled her chin back down on her paws, her body relaxing infinitesimally. The warmth was a language she understood. Next, the cardboard. She wrestled one of the larger boxes, unfolding it into a sturdy container. She lined the bottom with pages from an old, water-stained phone book she found. Then another layer of cleanish cardboard. It wasn't ideal, but it was a barrier against the cold concrete floor. She slid it next to the nest. Now for the hardest part, the transfer. "Okay, Mama," she said softly, kneeling again. "We're going to move you to a warmer spot. Just a few inches. I'm going to help, okay?" She didn't reach for the kittens. That was a line she wouldn't cross unless it was life or death. Instead, she gently took the edges of her own coat, the precious cargo nestled in its center. Mama's head lifted, her eyes sharp and alert. Sarah held her breath. This was the ultimate test. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice a steady, low chant. "It's just me. We're just moving to the box. It's better, I promise." With painstaking slowness, she began to slide the coat, with the entire family on it, across the concrete and into the waiting cardboard box. It was a movement of inches. Mama stayed perfectly still, her body tense, her eyes locked on Sarah's face, reading her intention. She allowed it. She trusted the process. The coat slid over the lip of the cardboard and settled into its new home. The space heater's glow washed over them. The tension broke. Mama rearranged herself, sniffing the new cardboard surroundings, before settling back down around her babies. The acceptance was complete. Sarah slumped against the cold furnace, the adrenaline receding and leaving her utterly spent. But she'd done it. They were contained. They had a modicum of heat. For now, they were okay. She checked her phone. 7% battery. 11:47 p.m. The storm would be raging at its peak outside. She was trapped down here. And she was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, perfectly, completely calm. The hours that followed were unlike any in Sarah's life. They were a vigil, a silent, sacred watch. She dozed in fits and starts, her head leaning back against the iron furnace, jerking awake every time the heater clicked or a kitten mewled too loudly. Each time she woke, her first action was to look into the box. Each time, she was met with the same sight. Mama, awake and watchful, or sleeping lightly, her ears twitching at every sound, her body a perfect fortress around her children. Sarah's mind, freed from the panic of the initial crisis, began to wander. She thought about her mother's hands, how they were always warm, even in winter. She thought about the last conversation they'd had, in the hospice room, when her mother, lucid for a fleeting moment, had squeezed her hand and whispered, You'll know what to do when it's time, Sarah Bear. You have all the love you need. You just have to decide to use it. She'd thought it was the morphine talking. Now, kneeling in a basement, guarding a cat and her newborns, she wondered if it had been a prophecy. As the night wore on, a strange peace settled over the basement. The storm's fury began to abate, the wind dying down to a low moan. The only sounds were the gentle hum of the heater, the soft suckling of the kittens, and the deep, resonant purr of their mother. The air, once frigid and hostile, was now close, warm, and carried the sweet, milky scent of new life. Sarah must have fallen into a deeper sleep because she was awakened by a change in the light. A weak, gray dawn was filtering through the high, grimy basement windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The storm had passed. The world outside was buried under a deep, pristine blanket of snow, and the silence was absolute. She stretched, her body one giant ache. She looked into the box. Mama was awake, cleaning a kitten with meticulous care. The little family was warm, alive, sleeping, eating. They had survived the night. A profound gratitude washed over her, so powerful it was dizzying. She had helped. She had been a part of this. She hadn't run. She hadn't failed. It was then that she saw it. Mama was shifting position, and as she moved, she revealed something tucked deep into the nest, right against her belly, next to the smallest tortoiseshell kitten. It wasn't a kitten. It was an object, something small and dark. Sarah's breath caught. She leaned forward slowly. Mama looked at her, and then deliberately looked down at the object, then back at Sarah, as if to say, This is for you. It was the fifth gift. But unlike the others, this one hadn't been found in the scrapyard. Sarah knew, with a certainty that shook her, exactly where it had come from. It was a small, smooth, oval-shaped riverstone, dark gray, and shot through with a single, thin, perfect vein of white quartz. It was beautiful. But its beauty wasn't what made Sarah's hands tremble. It was her mother's stone. Her mother had collected them from a river near their childhood home. She had them in bowls all over her apartment. She'd called them her worry stones, and she'd always carry one in her pocket, her thumb worrying that smooth, cool surface. After she died, Sarah had kept a few. One of them, her mother's favorite, the one with the quartz vein, had sat on Sarah's own windowsill. She'd kept it there for months, a touchstone to her grief. And then, one day, overwhelmed by the pain of it, she had taken it and thrown it out her kitchen window, into the alley below, in a fit of anguished fury. A final, childish attempt to sever the hurt. She had forgotten all about it, but Mama hadn't. During her secret reconnaissance missions, her absences from dinner, she hadn't just been scouting the basement. She had been in the alley. She had been gathering. And she had found it. This tiny, thrown-away piece of a broken heart. She had saved it. She had carried it in her mouth across the street, through the snow, down into this basement. She had kept it safe through the trauma of birth, and now she was giving it back. It wasn't a bottle cap. It wasn't a feather. It was an absolution. It was a message, delivered across species and through the veil of death itself. A message that said, I see all of you. Even the parts you tried to throw away, and I am giving them back to you, cleaned by my journey, made new again. You are whole. Sarah reached into the nest, her fingers brushing against Mama's warm fur. She picked up the stone. It was warm from the heat of the cat's body, from the warmth of the new life pressed against it. She closed her fingers around it, the smooth, familiar surface a balm on her soul. She bowed her head, and the tears came again. But they were quiet tears, healing tears. They were the tears that finally come after the storm has passed, when the world is washed clean and quiet, and all that's left is the profound, aching beauty of what remains. She looked at Mama, who was watching her, her green eyes deep and knowing. There were no words adequate for this moment. There was only the stone, warm in her hand, and the purr, vibrating through the floor, and the new light of dawn painting the basement in shades of soft gold. The story wasn't about a rescue. It was about a homecoming. For all of them. Later, that morning, when the sun was properly up and the world had begun to dig itself out, Sarah would make the trip upstairs. She would bring down a proper cardboard box, lined with soft towels straight from the dryer. She would bring a dish of water and a bowl of food for Mama, who would eat ravenously without leaving her post. She would unplug the old heater and make a plan to buy a safe, modern one. She would eventually, gently, move the entire family upstairs, to the quiet safety of her own bathroom, where the journey would truly begin. But for now, in the quiet of the basement dawn, she just sat. She held the stone. She watched the mother and her babies. Her life was softer now. The mornings felt lighter. The nights felt less heavy. The stone in her pocket wasn't a weight anymore. It was a touchstone to a love that had never left, only changed form. And the love in the box in front of her was a promise for the future. The cat's presence was a steady comfort. She would always be a wild thing, with her gifts and her secret roots and her independent spirit. She would come and go, but she would always come back, because this was home. They had built it together, out of loss and fear and hope, in the dark, and it was unshakable. The final gift wasn't the stone. The final gift was the understanding that love isn't about holding on tightly. It's about creating a space where something wild and precious feels safe enough to land. It's about being the one who stays, so others can find their way. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.